Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that this budget has been well received by the public at large, and there's also no doubt that this budget is vastly superior to the budget of last year, and it is also superior to anything that Labor produced during its 9 years. There are some good measures in this budget, Mr. Speaker, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I want to actually raise questions. I want to raise questions about two areas, and the last speaker raised a third area. I'm not going to touch on that, where this budget has, in my view, does not stand the test or examination. And the first is the area of expenditure. The government, prior to the budget, talked about expenditure increasing by around $1.2 billion. In fact, government expenditure under this budget increases by around $5.8 billion, or 9%, or around 9%. And that 9% is around 4 times the current rate of inflation. Now, it's fair to say that in looking at the increase in government expenditures, you should allow for the costs of offsetting the increase in GST. But even allowing for that, we have seen a situation where expenditure is increasing by around 3 times the rate of inflation. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that as a nation, we simply cannot put up with that or continue to do that for much longer. The unwillingness, frankly, of the government to deal with expenditure, either in last year's or this year's budget, will see debt servicing costs rise from around $2.4 this year to $4.5 billion in 2014. Or to put it another way, had this increase in debt not occurred, we could have had tax rates, a corporate tax rate, 4 cents lower, and personal income tax 4 cents lower. And that would frankly do a lot more to get growth going in this country than the increases in expenditure will. And there were options, frankly, Mr. Speaker, to reduce expenditure if we had been brave enough to take them. For example, there is approximately $3 billion of what I would call corporate welfare in this budget. And frankly, most of the people who are so-called beneficiaries of that corporate welfare, in my view, would have rather had a 4 or 5 cent extra cut in the corporate rate of tax and 4 or 5 cents extra in personal income tax rate than actually receiving that corporate welfare. Because I've never seen a government who can actually pick winners or spend the money as well as the individuals can. Now, the problem with this budget in terms of expenditure is also that, in my view, it takes a short-term view of expenditure. This budget has undoubtedly, Mr. Speaker, been tough on expenditure for a lot of departments. We have put a cap in place, and that cap lasts for 3 or 4 years in some cases. But while caps work for a while, they don't actually work in the long run, and they put pressure on the system, and what you require is much more fundamental change if we're going to work. And fundamental change requires of a government that they ask the right questions. They need to ask the first question is, should this department or department actually exist? If they say yes to that, they should move on and say, what functions do this department carry out, and which of these functions should continue? And from those functions that will continue, they need then to ask, are we delivering those functions in the most effective way? Or should they be opened up to competition? Should they become contestable? And even when we determine that the item is desirable, you still have to weigh up, is that item as desirable as some new request for government expenditure. Only by following this approach will we get expenditure under control, Mr. Speaker. The second issue I want to raise, and it's, I think, an important one, and the last speaker, David Parker, touched on it, is the whole issue of a growth framework outlined in the budget, which I have to say is totally inadequate. And it is not going to enable us to catch Australia by 2025, nor 2035, nor 2045. The fact is that the budget outlined 6 factors were indicated in their growth framework in the budget. The fact is also that amongst those 6, the most important item, if we're going to get growth, was not even mentioned. Not even mentioned. The most important item, if we're going to get growth back into this country, is the introduction of competition, particularly the introduction of competition within the state monopolies of health, education and welfare. If you don't want to privatise, if you don't want to open it up to the private sector, then you've got to design a system that enables competition to take place within those departments. I personally would want to see it opened up. Health, education and welfare services are approximately 30% of this economy, and they pose a huge problem because of the lack of productivity within that area. And we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years a decline in productivity in health for doctors of 15%, nurses for 11%, and there's nothing in this budget, that's going to do anything about that. In fact, in a way, we avoid facing up to it because there's increases in expenditure. And the same is true in education, where we have a system that's 70 years old and is failing 25% of our kids. 30,000 kids come out of school each year inadequately prepared for where they should be going. The idea, Mr. Speaker, in this budget that somehow we can flatline future expenditure growth in education and health is a nonsense. I know they'll say that there is a $1.1 billion allowance for new expenditure, but frankly that's no more than the rate of inflation, or not much more than the rate of inflation in the areas of education and health, and it is simply not realistic. So what are the 6 factors that the government mentioned in their growth strategy, and how is the government doing on each of them? There's a regulatory environment for business, education and skills, quality infrastructure. Nice idea, but hardly the reality. Mr. Speaker, I'll just go over and just finish by saying, and wind up by saying this. Mr. Speaker, the real cost of taxes is not the money individuals send to Wellington. Instead, it is the deadweight loss that arises when taxes alter how people behave, and we need to learn that. A review of OECD countries over a 40-year period revealed that those that had the fastest growth, averaged 6.6% a year, were those that spent less, Mr. Speaker, than 25% of GDP through government. If you jump to between 25 and 30% of GDP, the average growth rate fell from 6.6 to 4.7, or approximately 2%. The trend continues all the way up. When government expenditure was above 60% of GDP, the average growth rate falls to 1%. Over time, the compounding effect of adding just 1% percentage point to GDP growth are enormous, let alone the 4 to 5% we could achieve. The difference between these those countries that were achieving 6.6 and the 1.65% a year means that it takes 45 years to double your income in the case of those who are achieving 1.6 growth, and whereas those who are achieving 6.6 increase their growth or double their income every 11 years and over that 44 four times.